Now we're going to talk about fiber optic cable preparation. We're going to need a few tools for this. You will need some way to strip the fiber optic cable. You will need the proper crimper to crimp the metal ring on the fiber optic cable. You will need an X-Acto knife or a razor blade to cut the fiber optic cable. You will need a mandrel. You will also need a piece of 600 wet or dry sandpaper, and you will need the polishing material that comes in the kit. Once you've established how long the cables need to be, you can then proceed with the installation of the fiber optic ends. You get your cable. You then have to strip it. Be careful when you strip it so that you don't scar the fiber optic inside. Then you place the end with a metal collar on the end of the cable. I have stripped it so that there's approximately 3/8 to 1/2 of an inch sticking out the end. Once you've done that, you can then take your crimper, place the crimper around the metal ring, and squeeze until it's crimped. Now the end is on solid. The next thing you'll need to do is cut off the excess. What you'd like to do is come up with about a 1/16 or a 32nd of an inch sticking out the end of your fiber optic end. Once you've done that, you then need a small cup of water, and take that cup of water and pour about a 1-inch droplet onto the 600 wet or dry. You place the fiber optic end in the mandrel. You then place it in the water, and in a circular motion, lightly start sanding off the end of the fiber optic. When the end becomes smooth, you'll feel a slight difference in the way it travels across the 600 wet or dry. It will become relatively smooth instead of a rough, grady feeling. Once you've done that, you need to examine the end of the fiber optic to make sure it's smooth. Then, once you've finished that, take your water again, go to the polishing material, give yourself another 1-inch drop of water, and finish off the end of it. This will put a nice polish on the end, allowing the fiber optic to work at its very best. Once you've accomplished that, the fiber optic end is ready to be plugged into the machine. The next subject we're going to talk about is the fiber optic cabling. Once the power has been applied to the machines, we can go on ahead with our fiber optic installation. The fiber optic cable routing is described in the field service manual, and you can find all the details you need about where to route through the stands and through the machines in that manual. You'll be routing a fiber optic cable from machine to machine to machine and so on and so forth until you get all the machines hooked up and they will be hooked into some communication device. But for now, it is nothing more than a fiber optic cable coming into the side of the machine, coming up through the stand into the machine, and the blue end will be inside the machine. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to plug this into the fiber optic interface. If you look inside the machine, you'll find there is a black box with a few wires coming out of it right next to the fuse assembly. And what we'll be doing is inserting this end into the receptacle inside what we can now call the DLI, or digital logic interface. We can then place this into the rearmost receptacle on the bottom of this box, and you'll have to feel around and feel for the two different ones. To know if you've hooked it up correctly, what you can do is turn on the power of the machine, take a simple flashlight, and shine it into the end of this cable. You'll see a little red light come on in front. This lets you know that you have hooked it up correctly. Once you have done that, you know that you've gotten your cable exactly where you need it. The next thing you need to do is take another piece of fiber optic cable, and you will be taking the gray end of it this time, starting at the point where you saw the little red light flash, and you will place the gray end in that receptacle. Then you will take and route the blue end down through this machine, down through the stand, and out to the next machine. Once you've routed the fiber optic cable from this machine to the next machine, you then go to that next machine, locate the fiber optic cable, locate the blue end of the fiber optic cable, and you will plug it into the exact same receptacle you did in the last machine before, which will be the rearmost on the bottom of the DLI or the fiber optic interface, whichever yours is called. And once you've done that, you can then check that connection to make sure it's proper by taking your flashlight again, shining it into the end of the fiber optic cable, and then checking to make sure that the red light comes on this machine here. You will do that again and again and again until you get through with your whole bank of machines. The next subject we're going to talk about is a hookup of the CVT, LCOM, or CCOM to your row of machines. Once you've established the fiber optic loop that goes from machine to machine, you should have finished up with a blue end coming out of the last machine. You can then shine a light into the gray end, and you should see the light coming out of the blue end. The CVT is easily plugged in by taking the original end that you started out with into the first machine and plugging it into the black connector on the CVT. Then we take the other end that comes out of the last machine, which will have a blue connector on it, and you will plug it into the blue connector on the CVT. You will then place the phone line in the jack underneath the key switch. In this segment, we're going to be talking about software setup. The first thing you'll need to do is find out what your jurisdiction or your establishment requires you to do. If you're in a lottery environment, you'll need to find out from your central system operator what the address of the machine is and what the serial number of the machine is. Once you have established what the address and the serial number are going to be, you can then go into the setup mode and do that by pressing the self-test button the required number of times to get it into the self-test mode and following the instructions on the screen. In this particular case, we're going to be using the touch screen to go into our next feature by either touching the self-test button or pressing the icon on the screen. You will get to the VLT address. At this point, follow the instructions, whether it's hit the icon or turn a key or push a button. You can then increment the digit by touching the icon until you get the proper number. And once you've done that, you can then save it. Then you will go to the next page, and then you can set the serial number. The way we deal with this is to move the arrow to the digit that we want to change. At this point, we can then increment or decrement each digit till we finally get the number that we need. Once we are done with that, we then exit out. Once you have finished setting up the address and the serial number, you can then close the door and continue on with your functional test.